The Cabbage Patch Fib by Paul Jennings. My brother Chris is only 8 years old, which is rather young to have a baby. Well, have a baby's probably not quite the right way to put it, but there was a baby. It sure thought Chris was its father. He was in charge of it, that's for certain. Anyway, I'd better start at the beginning so you know the whole story. If you don't believe it, I don't blame you, but it's true. All started at tea time, the whole 8 of us. 6 kids, Mum and Dad. We were eating spaghetti. We kids were all killing ourselves laughing because Chris, who can be a real pain at times, had put a piece of spaghetti up his nose and left one end hanging out over his lip so that it looked like something I'd rather not talk about. It was a grotty thing to do, but it really did look funny, and we couldn't help cracking up. Dad hadn't noticed because he was too busy pretending not to be watching Doctor Who on TV. It's a rule in our family that TV's not on at tea time, but somehow or other Dad never notices that it's on until Doctor Who is over. Suddenly, Dad saw the piece of spaghetti and began to throw a wobbly. "Take that disgusting thing out of your nose," he roared at Chris. "You hopeless child." Dad started to go purple. Then he began banging his head up and down on the table next to his plate. "What did I do to deserve this?" he moaned. "First the boy puts the lengths of spaghetti up his nose, then I ask him to remove it, he sucks it in his mouth and swallows it. Doesn't anyone in this family have any table manners at all?" We all tried hard not to laugh, but giggles kept breaking out. On the TV I saw Doctor Who was just about to be eaten by a green two-headed monster. Funny music came on, which meant you had to wait until tomorrow to find out what happened. I knew Doctor Who wouldn't be eaten alive. He never is, because he has to be around for the next episode. Anyway, now that the show was over, Dad got up and switched it off. "That's it," he yelled. "From now on, there's no TV at tea time. We're having good manners and proper conversation for a change." He says this about once a week, and never lasts more than 1 or 2 days, so we're not worried. "I want proper discussion," Dad went on. "Intelligent conversation about important things you do at school. Like who made the moon, or where flies go in winter. Who has a topic for discussion?" There was a long silence, and then Chris said, "Where do babies come from, Dad?" Dad started to go red. He wasn't expecting this one. Well, it's like this. You see, Chris, they come from the Cabbage Patch. Yes, they come from the Cabbage Patch. Mum was looking at Dad in a funny way. She didn't like it because Dad was not telling Chris the truth. Everyone knew it was a fib, except Chris. He looked interested. "So how do they get there?" he asked. "They grow out of the cabbages. Yes, they grow out of the cabbages at night," said Dad weakly. "Wow," responded Chris. "There could be a new kid arrive tonight, couldn't there?" Everyone was looking daggers at Dad, but he just said, "Well, you never know. We could be just that unlucky." Then he got up and switched on the news, which meant we had to do the washing up. It's not fair how parents make the kids do all the work while they watch the news, but that's the way it is, even on days when we're not trying to get out of answers for difficult questions. Well, the rest of the evening passed as normal, and no more was said about babies. Finally, I went to bed and was just starting to fall off to sleep when I heard Chris get up. We share a room. He sleeps on the bunk above me. He climbed out of bed and got dressed, and he took his torch out of the top drawer of the dressing table. I heard him leave the bedroom. Then I heard as the back door closed. He'd gone outside. I quickly put on my tracksuit and followed him out into the backyard. Everything outside was dark, and at first I couldn't see where Chris had gone. Then I noticed the torch flashing right at the bottom of the garden, in the vegetable patch. I made my way down to Chris as quietly as I could, but he heard me coming and looked up from where he was rummaging about among the cabbages. I called out to him through the darkness. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm looking for babies," he said. "Dad reckons that one could be sprouting tonight. We can't just leave it out here till morning. Might catch a cold and die." "Ugh, no," I said. "You don't believe that load of codswallop, do you? Babies don't come out of cabbage patches. They grow inside their mother." A look of disbelief came over his face. "Where?" he said. "Whereabouts in their mother?" "Here," I said, rubbing my stomach. "Somewhere in here." "Oh, don't give me that," he said. "Pull the other one. That's where all the potato and sausages and gravy and custard go. You couldn't have a baby mixed up with that lot." "Oh, poor thing. You don't have to hide it from me. I'm old enough to know the truth about babies growing in the cabbage patch." He wouldn't listen to me anymore. He just kept searching under the cabbages. "Help me, look," he said. "One might have crawled over there under the potatoes." I decided to humour him, pretended to be searching for the baby amongst the vegetables. After a while I heard him say, "I've got one!" "Got what?" I asked. "A baby, of course," he replied. "Great," I said, making it out I believed him. He certainly had a good imagination. "Keep looking," he ordered. "There might be another one. It could be twins." I started to laugh to myself, but quickly stopped. I heard something that made my hair stand on end. It was a baby, crying. I rushed over to where Chris was pointing his torch at something on the ground, inside a cabbage leaf. I couldn't believe it. Chris was right. There was a baby, but it was the funniest looking one I'd ever seen. It was green and had a long pointed chin. It was naked, and it was crying. It didn't even have a blanket, just lay there shivering in the night air. "Oh, poor thing," said Chris as he picked it up. It stopped crying right away, started smiling and gooing. "Oh, it likes me," exclaimed Chris. "But it's green," I said. "Babies aren't supposed to be green. It must be sick. Oh, it might be dying. Here, give me a look at it." I took the baby from his arms. Straight away, it took one breath, screwed up its nose, and closed its eyes. "Stop breathing!" yelled Chris. "Quick, do something!" I tried to remember my first aid, but my mind was blank. "Oh no," I groaned. "It's holding its breath. Look, it's turning purple." It was too. The baby had stopped breathing, and instead of being green, it was turning purple. It started to jump from one foot to the other. I panicked, couldn't think of a thing to do, to get the baby to start breathing again. "Give it to me," yelled Chris, as he grabbed the still, purple infant from my arms. As soon as Chris had the baby in his arms, it let out a huge breath and commenced breathing. Slowly its colour turned from the bright purple back to green. "It thinks you're its mother," I said to Chris. "You're the first one to pick it up, so it thinks you're its mother. I've heard about this thing before. I once read of a duck that thought it was a rabbit because the first thing it saw after it hatched was a rabbit. This is the same thing. This baby thinks you're its mother. But green, I've never heard of a green baby before. We'd better get Mum and Dad." We hurried inside and woke Mum and Dad. They were amazed. Their eyes nearly popped out of their heads when they came out and saw the green baby. "Get the doctor!" screamed Dad. "The poor thing is green. It needs a doctor immediately." He ran off for the phone and called for the doctor. "Give it to me," said Mum. Took the baby away from Chris. Once the baby screwed up its nose, closed its eyes and stopped breathing, it started turning purple again. Chris grabbed the baby out of her arms, and once again it began breathing and went back to its normal colour. "It won't let anyone hold it except Chris," I told Mum. "It thinks he's its mother." "Father," corrected Chris. "It thinks I'm its father." The doctor arrived. The same thing happened. Baby wouldn't let anyone near it except Chris. The doctor couldn't even put a stethoscope on its chest without the baby turning purple. He called for an ambulance, which arrived with sirens blaring. "Chris will have to come to the hospital with the baby," said the doctor. "It needs special help. It stops breathing when Chris is not there, so he will have to come too." "No," said Mum. "Chris is not going. I'm not going to have him spend the rest of his life in hospital with this baby. He has to go to school. If you want to examine the baby, you will have to come here." The green baby started to suck Chris's arm. "Oh, it's hungry," said Mum. "You better give it its bottle, Chris." Chris was grinning his head off. He liked being a father. Well, for a while anyway. The baby soon took over Chris's life. He had to do everything for it because it would stop breathing as soon as anyone else came near. It would even hold its breath if Chris went off and left it. Chris changed its nappies, gave it bottles, bathed it, and even had to take it to bed with him. Everywhere that Chris went, the baby had to go too. We were famous. The TV people came and did a lot of shows about Chris and the baby. Everyone wanted to see the little green baby from the Cabbage Patch. Doctors and scientists and people from the hospital came to see it too. They all wanted to take it away, but none of them did any good. The baby just held its breath whenever anyone came close. Chris didn't care at first. He had 2 weeks off school and he loved his new child. In the end, though, the terrible day came. "You'll just have to go back to school, Chris," said Mum. "You can't stay home here for the rest of your life." "But what about the baby?" he protested. "I can't leave the baby. It'll die without me." "The baby will just have to go too," said Mum. "I've already made arrangements at the school. You can put its bassinet next to your desk." The next day, Chris fronted up to Shepperton Primary School. Every kid in school was there to meet him. and see his new baby. Chris's teacher, Mrs. Manley, was there too. Make way, she said. Give Chris and his baby room to breathe. Oh, isn't he a lovely mother, said someone in an unkind voice. The bell went and everyone trooped into school. One of Chris's mates told me what happened next. It was terrible. Chris put the baby and its bassinet down next to his desk and started his maths. After a while, the baby started to cry. It wants a feed, said Mrs. Manley. Go and get its bottle, Chris. Chris groaned. He didn't want to stop his work. He liked maths. It was his best subject. The baby sucked away at the bottle. It was a quick drinker. As soon as it was finished, it started to cry again. It must have wind, said Mrs. Manley. You'll have to burp it, Chris. Chris put the baby up on his shoulder and patted its back. Suddenly, the baby gave it an enormous burp which echoed around the room. The class started to laugh like mad. Everyone rolled around with tears running down their faces. They thought it was a great joke. Everyone except Chris. He was embarrassed and looked down at his shoes. Lunchtime, things got even worse. Everyone was playing British Bulldog. Sorry, Chris, said Mrs. Manley, but you can't play. It's too dangerous. If you fall over with the baby in your hands, it might get hurt. Chris tried to give his baby to a friend to mind, but it just started to hold its breath and turn purple, so he had to come back. He sat sadly on a seat, watching the other kids play. The baby slept on his lap. Soon, about 10 kids came to sit with him. They all had Cabbage Patch dolls in their hands. Every one of them. Every time Chris did something with his baby, the others would copy him. If he gave the baby a dummy, they gave their dolls a dummy. Chris tried to escape, but they followed him everywhere. In the afternoon, there was more trouble. While the class were doing spelling, someone said, "Oh, pooh, who fluffed?" "What a stink," said someone else. The kids all held their noses and grinned and pointed at each other. Mrs. Manley was cross with them. "It's the baby," she said. "It needs its nappy changed." Poor old Chris. He had to change the baby's nappy while the whole class watched, held up its legs, and wiped the yellow gunk away from the baby's bottom. "Ugh," said someone. "It's horrible." Chris had tears in his eyes. He grabbed up the baby and rushed home without stopping. That night at tea, Chris started shouting at everyone. "I don't want this baby anymore. I like it, but I don't want to look after it. I don't like being a father. I just want to be a kid. I want to go fishing and climb trees and play British Bulldog. I don't want a whole lot of people following me around with their stupid Cabbage Patch dolls." Mum looked sad. "I don't know what we can do, Chris. It won't let anyone else touch it except you. You don't want it to die, do you?" Chris didn't answer. He picked up the baby and stomped off. That night, when everyone else was asleep, I once again heard Chris creep out of the house. He had the baby with him, and once again I followed him down to the Cabbage Patch. I watched as Chris put the baby on the ground and started to creep off. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted. "You can't go off and leave it." "It's not mine," he yelled back. "I don't want it. This is where it came from, and I'm putting it back." Without another word, he turned around and rushed off. His footsteps faded off into the night. I looked at the baby. It was already turning purple and had stopped breathing. I didn't know what to do. I picked it up and tried to give it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it wouldn't get its mouth open. It had closed like a vice. I turned it upside down and gave it a whack on the bottom, but that didn't work either. The baby grew still. I'd never seen it so purple before. I thought it must be dead. A tear ran down my face and plopped into its little purple ear. "Don't die, baby," I whispered. "Please don't die." Then suddenly 2 hands reached down and took the baby from my arms. It was Chris. "I couldn't do it," he said. "I just couldn't let it die." The baby began to breathe again, and soon was its normal green colour. We sat down on the ground and talked. We talked for hours, but we couldn't think of any way to get Chris out of his problem. It looked like the poor kid was stuck with the baby until it grew up. Then, just as we were about to go back inside, I noticed something. "Hey," I said, "that's a big cabbage." We both looked. One of the cabbages was huge. I'd never seen such a big one before. "Oh, it's growing," said Chris. "Wow, look, it's growing in front of our eyes." I started to get nervous. Something funny was going on. This cabbage was growing so quickly you could actually see it expanding. It grew and grew until it was as big as a car. Then it stopped growing and just sat there. "I'm getting Dad," I said, but before I could move, an enormous leaf fell down to the ground, like a door opening up on the side of the cabbage. It was hollow inside. Without any warning, a small green woman with a pointed chin ran out and grabbed the baby from Chris. The baby grew even greener and started to smile. The green woman began chattering away in some foreign language in a high, squeaky voice. We couldn't understand a word, but we knew one thing. Boy, she was mad. She was shaking a finger at us and screaming away like nothing. Hey, it's not our fault, I said. We didn't take your baby. It was left here. We don't want it. You can have it back. Chris was nodding away like mad. He had a big smile on his face. Without another word, the little green woman turned around and rushed back into her cabbage with the baby. The leaf flapped back up and the cabbage closed. Straight away, it started to shrink. The cabbage shriveled up in front of our eyes until it was just a few shrunken, rotten leaves on the ground. The baby and its mother had gone. I didn't know where they went, but I do know one thing. Chris was real pleased that the baby had found its own people. Well, that's just about the end of the story. Dad pulled out all the cabbages and planted onions instead. He said it was better to be on the safe side, as the family was already big enough with 6 children. Mum looked at him square in the eye. There's one more thing, she said. You take that boy off to the bedroom this minute and you tell him where babies really come from. Dan went red, but he led Chris off and they had a good long talk. When they came out, Dad looked embarrassed. Chris didn't. He looked quite chirpy. Well, said Mum, do you know the truth about babies now? Chris nodded happily. The next night I was once again awakened by Chris leaving the house. This time he didn't go down to the vegetable garden. He fetched a ladder and went up onto the roof. After a while, I followed him and found him shining his torch down the chimney. What on earth do you think you're doing? I yelled. You think you're after Father Christmas or something? Shh, he said, pointing a finger to his lips, or you'll scare them off. Scare what off? I asked. The storks. Dad told me about how they bring the babies and drop them down the chimney. I took Chris back inside and sat him down. Then I told him honestly where babies come from. This time he believed me. Wow, was all he said. Then he jumped up and ran out of the room. Hey, where are you going this time? I yelled. To have a talk with poor old Dad, he said. It's about time somebody told him the truth.